Battle of Stalingrad, the bloodiest battle in history. Hello and welcome. Today, I'm going to whisper to you about one of the most pivotal and devastating battles of World War II, the Battle of Stalingrad. This monumental conflict, fought between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union, became a turning point not only in the Eastern Front but in the entire war. Lasting from August 23, 1942 to February 2, 1943, the Battle of Stalingrad is remembered for its brutal urban warfare, staggering loss of life, and its role in altering the course of history. Imagine a city in ruins, its streets filled with constant fighting, air raids, and harsh winter conditions. Named after Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, Stalingrad was not just a strategic target for Hitler's forces but a symbolic one. Its capture was intended to crush Soviet morale and secure Germany's dominance in the region. However, the fierce resistance of the Red Army, combined with the harsh Russian winter, turned the tide against the Nazis. In this video, we'll explore the critical phases of the battle, the human cost, and the lasting impact this grueling fight had on both Germany and the Soviet Union. So, get comfortable, relax, and let's dive into the incredible story of the Battle of Stalingrad. Hitler's strategic goals, why Stalingrad was key. In the summer of 1942, Adolf Hitler made a bold and fateful decision that would shape the remainder of World War II. The target? The city of Stalingrad, an industrial powerhouse nestled on the western banks of the Volga River. On the surface, Stalingrad might have seemed like just another Soviet city, but for Hitler, it was much more. To truly understand why he committed so much of Germany's military might to capturing this city, we need to dive into the strategic and symbolic importance Stalingrad held for both the Germans and the Soviet Union. Stalingrad wasn't just any city, it was a critical industrial hub for the Soviet Union. The factories in Stalingrad were churning out tanks, weapons, aircraft, and munitions, all of which were essential for the Red Army's efforts on the Eastern Front. Hitler believed that by capturing Stalingrad, he could disrupt Soviet production and bring the entire Soviet war effort to its knees. Without Stalingrad's industrial output, the Soviet military would struggle to maintain its defense, especially against the fast-advancing Wehrmacht. This wasn't just about taking control of a city, it was about crippling Soviet military capability. But that wasn't all. Stalingrad sat along the Volga River, one of the most vital transportation routes in the Soviet Union. The Volga connected the northern and southern parts of the country, serving as a major artery for shipping goods, resources, and, most importantly, oil from the Caucasus region. If the Germans could take Stalingrad, they would essentially cut off this vital supply route, preventing crucial resources from reaching the Soviet front lines. For Hitler, controlling the Volga meant starving the Red Army of the supplies it desperately needed to fight. And then there was Operation Blau, the larger German offensive in the summer of 1942. Hitler's ultimate goal wasn't just Stalingrad, it was the Caucasus, a region rich in oil that Germany needed to fuel its tanks, planes, and machinery. The oil fields at Baku were particularly important. Germany's war effort was running on fumes, and the vast oil reserves in the Caucasus were seen as the key to long-term survival. In Hitler's mind, taking Stalingrad was the first step towards securing these oil fields, giving Germany the resources it needed to continue fighting for years to come. But the importance of Stalingrad wasn't just strategic, it was also deeply symbolic. The city was named after Joseph Stalin, the Soviet Union's powerful and unyielding leader. Capturing a city bearing Stalin's name would be a devastating psychological blow to the Soviet people. It would undermine Stalin's authority, demoralize the Soviet Union, and signal that not even the most important Soviet symbols were safe from Nazi conquest. For Hitler, this was more than just a battle, it was a propaganda victory waiting to happen. Taking Stalingrad would demonstrate the power of the Third Reich and prove that Nazi Germany could crush even the most revered Soviet strongholds. On the other side, the defense of Stalingrad became a matter of national pride for the Soviet Union. Stalin himself knew the city's importance and ordered that it be defended at all costs. The famous Soviet order, "Not one step back," was issued, demanding that every soldier, civilian, and resource be thrown into the defense of Stalingrad. For the Soviets, losing Stalingrad wasn't an option. The city was more than just a place, it was a symbol of resistance and survival. The Red Army and the people of Stalingrad were prepared to fight street by street, building by building, to ensure that it would not fall into German hands. Hitler's confidence in his ability to capture the city was unshaken. He believed that the German Sixth Army, led by General Friedrich Paulus, would swiftly take the city, break Soviet resistance, and secure the Volga. In his mind, Stalingrad was a stepping stone to total victory on the Eastern Front. But, as we now know, this was a gross miscalculation. Hitler underestimated both the resolve of the Soviet defenders and the brutality of urban warfare in a city as large and complex as Stalingrad. As the Wehrmacht advanced toward the city, they quickly found themselves bogged down in intense street-to-street fighting. Stalingrad wasn't like the open plains where the German blitzkrieg had been so effective. This was urban warfare at its most brutal, with soldiers fighting over every inch of rubble, every building, and every factory. The city's narrow streets, ruined by constant bombing, made it impossible for tanks to maneuver effectively, turning the battle into a bloody and grueling infantry fight. Meanwhile, the Soviet defenders dug in. Civilians joined the fight. Factory workers continued producing tanks and weapons even as their factories were bombed, and the Red Army refused to yield. Stalin's order to defend the city at all costs became the rallying cry of the Soviet forces. For the Germans, what was supposed to be a swift victory turned into a bitter war of attrition, where every step forward came at a heavy cost in lives and resources. And then came the Russian winter. Hitler had hoped to take the city before the cold set in, but the battle dragged on. As the temperatures plummeted, the German troops, ill-prepared for the harsh conditions, began to suffer. Supplies dwindled, morale dropped, and the once dominant German army found itself surrounded by a determined enemy, fighting in a frozen wasteland. For Hitler, Stalingrad had been the key to winning the war on the Eastern Front. Instead, it became the key to his downfall. The battle for Stalingrad would prove to be a turning point in World War II, marking the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany's ambitions in the Soviet Union. What Hitler had hoped would be a quick and decisive victory turned into one of the most devastating defeats in German military history. Barbarossa and the path to Stalingrad, the initial Soviet resistance. Before the battle for Stalingrad even began, the seeds of the conflict were sown in 1941 when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the largest military invasion in history. Barbarossa was Nazi Germany's ambitious plan to conquer the Soviet Union, crush communism, and seize the vast resources of the East. The initial German advance was swift and devastating. In the first few months, the Wehrmacht swept through Soviet territories, capturing hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers, destroying Soviet equipment, and bringing the German army dangerously close to Moscow. But while Barbarossa had been designed to deliver a quick and decisive victory, things didn't go according to plan. The Soviet Union, vast and resilient, put up far more resistance than Hitler had anticipated. The Red Army, though caught off guard and suffering immense losses, managed to regroup. Under the harsh conditions of the Russian winter and with the determined leadership of Joseph Stalin, the Soviets fought back, slowing the German advance and eventually halting them just outside Moscow. It's important to understand how Operation Barbarossa set the stage for what would eventually happen at Stalingrad. Hitler's plan for a blitzkrieg, or lightning war, worked well in the early stages of the invasion. The Germans relied on speed, superior firepower, and coordinated attacks between tanks, infantry, and aircraft to overwhelm Soviet forces. But while the Wehrmacht experienced significant victories, the deeper they pushed into Soviet territory, the more stretched their supply lines became. By the time the harsh Russian winter of 1941 set in, the German forces were overextended and underprepared for the freezing temperatures. The severe cold crippled German machinery, slowed troop movements, and led to significant casualties from frostbite and exposure. Meanwhile, the Soviets, who were more accustomed to the brutal winters, used this to their advantage, launching counterattacks that forced the Germans onto the defensive for the first time in the war. One of the key moments during Barbarossa was the Siege of Leningrad, which began in September 1941 and lasted for nearly 900 days. The Germans, along with Finnish forces, surrounded the city and attempted to starve the population into submission. While the siege was a humanitarian disaster for the Soviet Union, it demonstrated the resolve of the Soviet people. Despite extreme hunger, bombings, and freezing conditions, the city refused to surrender. This resilience became a hallmark of Soviet resistance throughout the war and would play a significant role in the defense of Stalingrad as well. As the fighting dragged on into 1942, Hitler realized that his hopes of a quick victory were fading. The Soviet Union wasn't collapsing as he had predicted, and the war in the East was turning into a war of attrition, a battle not just of armies but of economies and resources. Hitler knew that if Germany was going to have any chance of defeating the Soviet Union, he would need to seize control of the resources that powered the Soviet war machine. This is where Stalingrad comes back into the picture. After the failure to capture Moscow, Hitler shifted his focus south, toward the oil-rich Caucasus region. The plan was to destroy the Soviet Union's ability to fight by cutting off their access to critical resources. Stalingrad, as we explored earlier, was the key to this plan. It was the gateway to the Caucasus, and without controlling the Volga and Stalingrad, Hitler knew that any advance on the oil fields would be vulnerable. However, Hitler's obsession with capturing Stalingrad would soon prove to be his undoing. As the Wehrmacht pushed toward the city in the summer of 1942, the Soviet Red Army, now better prepared and more organized than during the initial stages of Barbarossa, began to dig in for what would become one of the most brutal and bloody battles of the war. But it's important to remember that Stalingrad wasn't just a battle between two armies, it was also a clash of ideologies. For Hitler, this was a battle against communism, a chance to prove the superiority of Nazi ideology. For Stalin, the defense of Stalingrad was a matter of survival, not just for the city, but for the Soviet Union itself. As a result, both leaders committed everything they had to the battle, refusing to back down, no matter the cost. The Soviet resistance in the early stages of the war set the tone for what would come next. Despite being caught off guard by Barbarossa, the Soviets managed to hold on, regroup, and fight back. This resilience, combined with the harsh Russian winter and the vastness of the Soviet Union, had already forced the Germans into a prolonged conflict they hadn't anticipated. Now, with Stalingrad on the horizon, both sides were about to be drawn into a battle that would decide the fate of the Eastern Front. As the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus marched towards Stalingrad, they expected to face fierce resistance, but they couldn't have known just how determined the Soviets would be to defend their city. The stage was set for an epic confrontation, one that would stretch both armies to their limits and change the course of the war. In the coming months, Stalingrad would transform from a key strategic target into a symbol of Soviet defiance, and the cost of that defiance would be paid in blood by both sides. The siege begins, Stalingrad under fire. By the time the German Sixth Army under General Friedrich Paulus reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in August 1942, the city had already transformed into a fortress. The Soviet defenders and civilians knew that Stalingrad was a critical target for the Nazis, and they were determined to make it as difficult as possible for the Germans to take. As the battle approached, the citizens and soldiers of Stalingrad prepared for what would soon become one of the bloodiest confrontations in history. For Hitler, the capture of Stalingrad was meant to be swift. The German strategy had always relied on speed and overwhelming firepower, a tactic that had worked during the early stages of Operation Barbarossa. But Stalingrad was different. The Germans were not fighting in the wide, open plains of the Soviet Union anymore. They were entering an urban landscape where every building, every street, and every factory would become a battlefield. What followed was a brutal siege that would stretch on for months. In late August, the Luftwaffe, Germany's air force, launched a massive bombing campaign over Stalingrad. The goal was to break the Soviet defenders' spirit and soften the city's defenses before the ground assault began. Stalingrad was bombed relentlessly, with thousands of tons of explosives raining down on the city. Residential areas, industrial sites, and transportation hubs were all targeted. Buildings crumbled, factories were set ablaze, and countless civilians were caught in the crossfire. However, rather than weakening the Soviet resolve, the bombing campaign only served to strengthen it. The city may have been reduced to rubble, but the ruins provided cover for the Red Army. What the Germans didn't anticipate was how urban warfare would play to the Soviets' advantage. As German tanks and infantry began moving into the city, they were immediately met with fierce resistance from Soviet forces who had dug into the rubble. Factories became fortresses, apartment buildings became strongholds, and the Soviets turned every inch of the city into a defensive position. The Soviet 62nd Army, under the command of General Vasily Zhukov, was tasked with defending Stalingrad. Zhukov's strategy was simple but effective: get as close to the enemy as possible. This tactic, known as hugging the enemy, was designed to neutralize the Germans' advantage in air power and artillery. By engaging the Germans in close-quarters combat, Zhukov made it difficult for the Luftwaffe to bomb Soviet positions without risking friendly fire. This forced the Germans into a brutal, face-to-face fight, with soldiers battling each other in the ruins of the city. The fighting was intense and chaotic. Entire city blocks changed hands multiple times in a single day. Snipers became a key element of the battle, with both sides using the devastated urban landscape to their advantage. Soviet snipers, such as the legendary Vasily Zaitsev, became heroes of the battle, picking off German officers and disrupting enemy operations. Zaitsev's exploits became famous across the Soviet Union, boosting morale as he reportedly killed hundreds of German soldiers during the siege. Despite their early advances, the Germans found themselves bogged down in the urban warfare they hadn't fully prepared for. Tanks, which had been so effective on the open plains, were often useless in the narrow streets of Stalingrad. Infantry units were forced to clear buildings one by one, a slow and costly process that drained German resources and morale. The Soviets, meanwhile, used the ruins to their advantage, launching surprise attacks and ambushes from hidden positions. As the fighting raged on, both sides began to suffer enormous casualties. The Germans, who had initially expected a swift victory, were now facing fierce resistance at every turn. Supplies were running low, and the harsh conditions of urban combat were taking a toll on the soldiers. Meanwhile, the Soviet defenders were stretched to their limits, with Zhukov's 62nd Army holding on by sheer determination. Life for the civilians of Stalingrad was a living nightmare. While some had been evacuated before the battle began, many remained trapped in the city. Food and water were scarce, and the constant bombing and gunfire made survival a daily challenge. Civilians sought shelter in basements, sewers, and makeshift bunkers, but no place was truly safe. The people of Stalingrad played their part in the defense, with many joining the fight alongside the Red Army. Others worked in the factories that were still operational, producing weapons and supplies even as the battle raged around them. One of the most iconic locations in the battle was the Mami of Kurgan, a strategically important hill overlooking the city. Whoever controlled Mami of Kurgan controlled much of Stalingrad, as it offered a commanding view of the battlefield. The hill became the site of some of the most intense fighting of the siege, with control of the hill shifting between the Germans and Soviets multiple times. By the end of the battle, the hill had been reduced to a barren wasteland, with thousands of bodies buried beneath the earth. As the siege dragged on, General Paulus faced increasing pressure from Hitler to capture the city, but Stalingrad had become a meat grinder for both sides. The Germans were losing men and supplies at an alarming rate, and the Soviet defenders, though battered and bloodied, refused to give in. Every attempt by the Germans to take the city was met with fierce Soviet counterattacks, and as winter approached, the battle showed no signs of ending. Stalingrad was no longer just a strategic target, it had become a symbol of resistance. Both sides knew that the outcome of this battle would have far-reaching consequences. For the Germans, Stalingrad was supposed to be the key to their victory on the Eastern Front. For the Soviets, the defense of Stalingrad represented the determination of an entire nation to stand against the Nazi war machine. But as the fighting dragged into the cold months of late 1942, it became clear that the battle for Stalingrad was far from over. The stage was set for a brutal winter siege, where not only bullets and bombs but the bitter cold would play a decisive role in the outcome. Winter sets in, the turning point in the Battle of Stalingrad. As the battle for Stalingrad dragged into the final months of 1942, the brutal Russian winter began to take hold. This winter, one of the coldest on record, would not only test the physical endurance of the soldiers on both sides, but also become a critical factor in deciding the outcome of the battle. The relentless cold, combined with dwindling supplies and exhaustion, began to push the German forces to their breaking point. For the Wehrmacht, the onset of winter was a logistical and strategic nightmare. When the Germans had first launched their offensive towards Stalingrad in the summer, they had expected a swift victory, much like their earlier campaigns. The prolonged fighting in the city, however, had left them severely overextended. As the winter approached, German soldiers found themselves woefully unprepared for the freezing conditions. Unlike the Red Army, which was accustomed to harsh Russian winters, the Germans lacked adequate winter clothing and supplies, leaving them vulnerable to frostbite, illness, and exposure. Temperatures plummeted, often dropping to below -30 degrees Celsius -22 degrees Fahrenheit, and the frozen landscape of Stalingrad became an unforgiving battlefield. German machinery, including their tanks and trucks, struggled to function in the extreme cold. Engines froze, weapons jammed, and the once dominant blitzkrieg tactics that had worked so well in the open plains became useless in the frozen, ruined streets of Stalingrad. Soldiers huddled together for warmth in the ruins of buildings, with little protection from the biting winds and snow. Meanwhile, the Soviet forces were better equipped for the winter and knew how to use the freezing conditions to their advantage. General Vasily Chukov and his 62nd Army had been fighting in Stalingrad for months, and though they were battered and exhausted, they were not defeated. As the German advance slowed, the Soviets launched a series of well-planned counterattacks, using the cover of snow and ice to move troops and supplies around the city undetected. Soviet snipers, camouflaged in white, continued to harass the German forces, picking off soldiers one by one as they tried to take shelter in the rubble. However, the real turning point came with the Soviet launch of Operation Uranus in November 1942. While the Germans had been focusing their efforts on taking the city itself, Soviet forces under Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky had been quietly building up their strength outside Stalingrad. Operation Uranus was a massive counteroffensive designed not to drive the Germans out of the city, but to encircle them. The Soviets aimed to trap the German Sixth Army inside Stalingrad, cutting off their supply lines and leaving them isolated in the freezing city. On November 19, 1942, Soviet forces launched a surprise two-pronged attack from the north and south of Stalingrad, targeting the weaker Romanian and Italian forces that were guarding the German flanks. These Axis forces, ill-equipped and lacking the training and resources of the Wehrmacht, were quickly overwhelmed by the Soviet assault. Within days, the Soviets had completed their encirclement, trapping over 300,000 German soldiers inside Stalingrad. This was a catastrophic blow to the German war effort. The Sixth Army, once the pride of the Wehrmacht, was now surrounded, cut off from reinforcements and supplies. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus and his men were left in a desperate situation, with no way to break out of the Soviet encirclement and no supplies coming in. The Germans, now trapped in Stalingrad's ruins, had to face the full force of the Russian winter without adequate food, ammunition, or medical supplies. What had once been an offensive to capture the city had now turned into a fight for survival. Hitler, unwilling to accept defeat, ordered Paulus to hold Stalingrad at all costs. Rather than allowing a retreat or surrender, Hitler insisted that the Sixth Army fight to the last man, declaring that Stalingrad was to be a fortress that must not fall into Soviet hands. He also promised that Luftwaffe air supply drops would keep the encircled army resupplied. However, this plan was doomed from the start. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin and hindered by the winter conditions, was unable to deliver enough food, fuel, or ammunition to sustain the trapped German forces. The situation inside the German pocket grew increasingly desperate. Soldiers were starving, freezing, and succumbing to disease. The once proud Sixth Army had become a shadow of its former self, reduced to scavenging for food in the ruins and using makeshift hospitals to treat the wounded. As the weeks passed, morale plummeted, and the German soldiers knew that relief was unlikely to come. The Soviets, meanwhile, tighten the noose around the trapped Germans. With each passing day, the Red Army grew stronger, receiving reinforcements and supplies from across the Soviet Union. While the Germans suffered in the cold, Soviet morale was boosted by the success of Operation Uranus and the growing sense that they were on the verge of a historic victory. Stalingrad, once a symbol of Nazi dominance, was now becoming a symbol of Soviet resilience and determination. For Stalin and his generals, the encirclement of the German Sixth Army was a triumph, but they knew the battle wasn't over yet. The Germans, though weakened, were still capable of fighting back, and Hitler's refusal to allow a retreat meant that the Red Army would have to continue the bloody work of clearing out the remaining German forces in Stalingrad. The battle for the city would rage on for several more months, but the tide had undeniably turned in favor of the Soviet Union. Winter had become the Germans' worst enemy. What had started as a campaign to conquer Stalingrad and secure Germany's future in the East had now become a desperate struggle for survival in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. For the Soviets, it was clear the Germans were on the verge of defeat, and Stalingrad would soon become the graveyard of the Wehrmacht's ambitions. Operation Uranus, the encirclement of the German Sixth Army. By November 1942, after months of brutal fighting in the ruins of Stalingrad, the balance of power was shifting. The Germans, once confident in their ability to capture the city, were now facing a desperate situation. Hitler's decision to turn Stalingrad into a symbol of Nazi strength had instead become a symbol of Germany's vulnerability. The Soviets, meanwhile, were quietly preparing for a bold and decisive move that would forever change the course of the war on the Eastern Front. That move was Operation Uranus. While the Germans had been focused on taking the city itself, Soviet planners, led by Generals Georgy Zhukov and Alexander Vasilevsky, were planning something far more ambitious. Rather than directly confronting the Germans in the heart of Stalingrad, the Soviets decided to attack the weaker flanks of the German lines, which were held by Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops. These Axis forces were far less equipped, less trained, and far less capable of holding the line compared to the Wehrmacht. The Germans had stretched their resources too thin, and the Soviets saw this as an opportunity to strike. The plan for Operation Uranus was simple in its brilliance. Two Soviet armies would launch pincer movements, one from the north and one from the south, aimed at cutting off the German Sixth Army and trapping them inside the city. The Soviets had spent months building up their forces in secret, amassing troops, tanks, and artillery for the coming offensive. The goal wasn't just to push the Germans out of Stalingrad, it was to completely encircle them, cutting them off from supplies and reinforcements, and eventually forcing their surrender. On the morning of November 19, 1942, the Soviet offensive began. In the north, the Southwest Front, commanded by General Nikolai Vatutin, launched a massive attack against the Romanian Third Army, which was defending the northern flank of the German positions. The Romanian forces, poorly equipped and outnumbered, were quickly overwhelmed by the sheer force of the Soviet assault. Soviet T-34 tanks and infantry broke through the Romanian lines, advancing rapidly toward the city. Within a matter of hours, the northern pincer of the Soviet attack was well underway. Meanwhile, to the south of Stalingrad, the Stalingrad Front, led by General Andrei Yeremenko, launched a simultaneous attack against the Romanian Fourth Army and the weaker Italian units defending the southern flank. As in the north, the Axis forces were no match for the overwhelming firepower and determination of the Soviet forces. The southern pincer quickly broke through, and Soviet tanks and infantry began their rapid advance, aiming to link up with the northern force and complete the encirclement. The speed and effectiveness of the Soviet attack caught the Germans by surprise. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, commanding the German Sixth Army, was still focused on fighting in the heart of Stalingrad and didn't initially grasp the gravity of the situation unfolding on his flanks. By the time Paulus and the German High Command realized what was happening, it was too late. The Soviet pincer movements had already begun to close around Stalingrad. On November 23, 1942, just 4 days after the operation began, Soviet forces from the north and south met at the small town of Kalik, west of Stalingrad. The encirclement was complete. The German Sixth Army, along with several divisions of supporting Axis troops, was now trapped inside Stalingrad. Over 300,000 German soldiers were encircled, cut off from reinforcements, supplies, and any hope of retreat. This was a disaster of unprecedented scale for the German war effort. Hitler had ordered Paulus to take Stalingrad at all costs, but now the Sixth Army found itself in a dire situation. The Germans, who had once been the attackers, were now on the defensive, trapped inside the very city they had been trying to conquer. The Soviet encirclement, known as the Kessel, or Cauldron, was a deadly trap. With Soviet forces now surrounding the city on all sides, the Germans had no way to break out. Supplies, already stretched thin, became even more scarce. Food, ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies were in short supply, and the harsh Russian winter only made matters worse. German soldiers were forced to fight not only the Soviets but also starvation, disease, and the bitter cold. For the Soviet leadership, the success of Operation Uranus was a turning point in the battle for Stalingrad. The Red Army had gone from being on the defensive to taking the offensive. The encirclement of the German Sixth Army was not just a military victory, it was a symbol of Soviet resilience and strategic brilliance. For Stalin, it was a personal triumph, proving that the Soviet Union could stand up to the might of Nazi Germany and turn the tide of the war. But while the Soviets celebrated their victory, the battle for Stalingrad was far from over. The encircled German forces, despite their desperate situation, continued to fight. Hitler, unwilling to accept the loss of the Sixth Army, ordered Paulus to hold the city at all costs. He refused to allow a retreat, insisting that the Luftwaffe would supply the encircled army by air. This was a tragic miscalculation. The Luftwaffe, already stretched thin and facing increasingly effective Soviet anti-aircraft defenses, was unable to deliver the supplies needed to sustain the Sixth Army. Only a fraction of the required food, fuel, and ammunition made it through the Soviet lines. The Germans inside Stalingrad were left to starve and freeze as the Soviets tightened their grip on the city. For Paulus and his men, the situation became increasingly hopeless. The once proud German Sixth Army, which had been poised to take Stalingrad and secure a major victory for Hitler, was now fighting for survival in the frozen ruins of the city. Every day, Soviet forces grew stronger, receiving reinforcements and supplies from across the Soviet Union, while the Germans grew weaker and more isolated. The encirclement of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of the end for the German campaign in the Soviet Union. Stalingrad, once seen as the key to victory, had become a death trap for the German forces. The failure of Operation Uranus was a devastating blow to the German war effort and would have far-reaching consequences for the remainder of World War II. As the battle dragged on, it became clear that the Germans were running out of time and options. The Soviet Union, having withstood the initial onslaught of Operation Barbarossa, was now on the offensive, and the tide of the war on the Eastern Front had begun to turn in their favor. The desperation of the encircled, life inside the Stalingrad castle. By the end of November 1942, the German Sixth Army and supporting Axis forces found themselves trapped in what became known as the Stalingrad Castle, the Cauldron. Encircled by Soviet forces after the success of Operation Uranus, over 300,000 German soldiers, along with Romanian and Italian units, were now cut off from the rest of the Wehrmacht, trapped inside the frozen ruins of Stalingrad. The Germans had gone from being the attackers to the ones under siege, and life inside the castle quickly turned into a desperate struggle for survival. At first, the German High Command, and Hitler in particular, refused to believe that the situation was as dire as it was. Hitler, in typical fashion, forbade any retreat. His infamous order to Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus was simple: hold Stalingrad at all costs. Hitler insisted that the Luftwaffe would be able to supply the Sixth Army by air, providing them with the food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies they needed to continue the fight. But this plan was deeply flawed from the start. The Luftwaffe, which had been stretched thin across multiple fronts, simply didn't have the capacity to supply the encircled army with the massive amount of resources required to sustain a force of hundreds of thousands. To make matters worse, the Soviet anti-aircraft defenses were well prepared, and many of the German supply planes were shot down before they could reach the castle. The reality was brutal. Of the 700 tons of supplies the Germans needed daily to survive, the Luftwaffe was only able to deliver a fraction of that amount, sometimes as little as 80 tons per day. The soldiers inside the castle were left with dwindling food rations, rapidly decreasing stocks of ammunition, and little to no medical supplies to treat the growing number of wounded. The winter conditions only made matters worse, with temperatures often plunging to minus 30 degrees Celsius, minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. For the German soldiers trapped inside Stalingrad, the situation became increasingly hopeless as the days passed. Starvation quickly set in. Soldiers, who had once marched confidently into the city, now found themselves scavenging for food in the frozen ruins, desperately trying to survive on whatever scraps they could find. Horses that had been used to pull equipment were slaughtered for food, and once the horses were gone, soldiers began boiling leather belts and boots in a desperate attempt to extract any possible nourishment. But even these grim measures weren't enough. Frostbite and disease spread rapidly among the German forces. With little fuel available, soldiers were unable to keep warm, and many froze to death in their makeshift shelters. Medical supplies were nearly non-existent, and the overworked and understaffed field hospitals were overwhelmed with wounded and sick soldiers. Typhus, dysentery, and other illnesses ravaged the encircled army. Those who were wounded often died not from their injuries but from infection or the freezing cold, as doctors were powerless to stop the spread of disease without the necessary medicine. Amid the misery and despair, discipline began to break down. Morale, already low, plummeted even further as it became clear that the promised relief from the Luftwaffe was never coming. Soldiers who had once followed orders without question began to lose faith in their commanders and in Hitler's promises. Some units refused to continue fighting, while others surrendered to the Soviets in the hope of escaping the frozen hell that Stalingrad had become. Despite the terrible conditions, Hitler refused to allow Paulus and the Sixth Army to surrender. He saw the battle for Stalingrad not just as a military operation but as a matter of prestige. Losing Stalingrad would be a devastating blow to Nazi Germany's image of invincibility, and Hitler was unwilling to admit defeat. He insisted that the Sixth Army hold the city at all costs, even as it became increasingly clear that there was no way out. Inside the castle, Paulus and his officers faced an impossible situation. They were running out of time, out of options, and out of men. Paulus, who had once been a loyal and obedient officer, now found himself questioning the wisdom of Hitler's orders. But even as the situation grew more desperate, Paulus hesitated to disobey the Führer's direct commands. For him, the fear of defying Hitler was as great as the fear of losing his army. As the weeks wore on, the Germans began to realize that no relief was coming. The Luftwaffe's efforts to supply the castle by air were failing, and the Soviet forces surrounding the city were growing stronger with each passing day. Any hope of a breakout was quickly extinguished when a German relief effort, known as Operation Winter Storm, failed in December 1942. Led by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, the relief force was supposed to break through the Soviet lines and rescue the trapped Sixth Army. But Winter Storm never made it close enough to Stalingrad, and the Germans inside the castle were left to fend for themselves. Life inside the castle became unbearable. Starvation claimed more lives than Soviet bullets, and the once proud German army was reduced to a skeleton of its former self. Soldiers who had entered Stalingrad as part of one of the most powerful military forces in history were now reduced to freezing, starving shadows of their former selves, huddled together in the ruins, waiting for the inevitable. Meanwhile, the Soviets tightened their grip on the city. Stalin's forces were relentless in their determination to destroy the Sixth Army and claim a decisive victory. Soviet artillery and infantry attacked the German positions day and night, gradually pushing the encircled Germans deeper into the city. The Soviets knew that time was on their side, and they could afford to wait as the Germans slowly withered away inside the castle. For the German soldiers trapped in Stalingrad, it was not just a physical battle but a psychological one. They were surrounded, starving, freezing, and facing the terrifying reality that no help was coming. As supplies ran out, many soldiers began to lose hope, and cases of desertion and suicide became more common. Those who tried to escape the castle often met with death either at the hands of Soviet forces or in the frozen wilderness outside the city. By January 1943, the situation was beyond dire. The once formidable Sixth Army had been reduced to less than half its original strength, and those who remained were in no condition to fight. The cold, the hunger, and the constant Soviet attacks had taken their toll, and it was clear that the end was near. Stalingrad, once seen as the key to German victory on the Eastern Front, had become a tomb for the Sixth Army. As the new year dawned, the Germans inside the castle knew that their time was running out. The question was no longer if they would lose the battle, but when. The fall of the Sixth Army, Paulus, and the final surrender. By early January 1943, the German Sixth Army, once considered one of the most formidable fighting forces in the world, was on the verge of total collapse. Encircled by Soviet forces in the Stalingrad castle for nearly 2 months, the Germans were now facing starvation, bitter cold, and relentless Soviet attacks. The men who had once marched confidently into Stalingrad were now reduced to freezing, emaciated shadows of their former selves. As the new year dawned, the situation inside the castle was becoming unbearable. Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the Sixth Army, found himself in an impossible situation. He had followed Hitler's orders to hold the city at all costs, despite the overwhelming odds. The promise of a relief force, Operation Winter Storm, had failed, and the Luftwaffe's attempts to supply the encircled army by air had been woefully inadequate. With no food, no ammunition, and no medical supplies, the Sixth Army was rapidly disintegrating. Inside the German lines, soldiers were dying not just from Soviet bullets, but from starvation and disease. The field hospitals, already overwhelmed, had long since run out of medicine. Frostbite was rampant, and the freezing temperatures claimed more lives every day. Many soldiers, weakened by hunger and illness, simply gave up, succumbing to despair as Soviet artillery pounded their positions. Others, desperate to escape the horrors of the Kessel, deserted or took their own lives. Despite the dire circumstances, Hitler continued to demand that Paulus and his men hold Stalingrad. The city had become a symbol of Nazi determination, and Hitler was unwilling to allow it to fall. He promoted Paulus to Field Marshal on January 30, 1943, a symbolic gesture that carried a sinister undertone. No German Field Marshal had ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to fight to the death or take his own life rather than give up the city. Paulus, however, was not prepared to make such a sacrifice. The reality of the situation was clear. The Sixth Army was finished. By late January, the Soviet forces, under the command of General Vasily Zhukov, were closing in on the last pockets of German resistance. The Red Army had systematically destroyed the remaining German positions, and Soviet troops were now fighting their way through the city's ruins, pushing the encircled Germans deeper into Stalingrad. On January 31, 1943, Paulus made the decision that Hitler had dreaded. He surrendered. The southern pocket of the German forces, including Paulus and his staff, was captured by the Soviets. The northern pocket, under General Karl Strecker, held out for a few more days, but by February 2, 1943, the battle for Stalingrad was over. The German Sixth Army had been annihilated. The Soviet victory at Stalingrad was a monumental turning point in World War II. For the Germans, it was a catastrophic defeat, one from which they would never fully recover. Over 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner, including 24 generals. Of those captured, fewer than 6,000 would ever return to Germany. The rest would die in Soviet captivity, victims of starvation, disease, and brutal conditions in the Gulag camps. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was a moment of triumph. The Red Army had not only defended the city but had decisively crushed the German forces that had sought to capture it. Stalingrad became a symbol of Soviet resilience and determination, and the victory was celebrated across the nation. Stalin, who had personally overseen the defense of the city, emerged from the battle with his reputation greatly enhanced, both at home and abroad. The consequences of the battle extended far beyond Stalingrad itself. The defeat of the Sixth Army shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility and marked the beginning of a long and bloody Soviet counteroffensive that would eventually push the Germans out of Soviet territory altogether. The loss of Stalingrad was a devastating blow to German morale, and the Wehrmacht would never regain the strength it had before the battle. Hitler, who had refused to allow a retreat or surrender, was furious at Paulus for capitulating. The fall of Stalingrad was a personal humiliation for the Führer, who had staked so much on the city's capture. In the months and years that followed, Hitler's obsession with holding territory at all costs would lead to further disasters for the German military. Stalingrad's legacy, however, went beyond its military significance. The battle, which had claimed the lives of hundreds of thousands of soldiers and civilians, became a symbol of the horrors of war. The city itself was left in ruins, and the human cost of the fighting was staggering. It's estimated that over 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, were killed, wounded, or captured during the battle, making it one of the deadliest engagements in human history. For the survivors of Stalingrad, the scars of the battle would never fully heal. Those who had endured the siege, whether as soldiers or civilians, carried with them the memories of the brutal winter, the constant bombardment, and the loss of life on an unimaginable scale. Stalingrad had become a graveyard, a testament to the ferocity of war and the devastating impact it could have on both nations and individuals. In the end, the Battle of Stalingrad was not just a military defeat for Nazi Germany, it was a symbolic and psychological turning point in World War II. The fall of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's ambitions in the East, and from that point forward, the tide of the war began to turn in favor of the Allies. The aftermath of Stalingrad, a turning point in World War II. The surrender of the German Sixth Army in February 1943 marked the end of one of the bloodiest and most brutal battles in human history. The Battle of Stalingrad, which had raged for over 5 months, claimed the lives of over 2 million people, including soldiers and civilians. The city itself was left in ruins, its buildings shattered by relentless artillery fire, air raids, and close-quarters combat. As the dust settled, the consequences of the battle became clear, not just for the city of Stalingrad, but for the entire course of World War II. For Nazi Germany, the loss of the Sixth Army was a devastating blow, militarily, psychologically, and symbolically. The Sixth Army had been one of the Wehrmacht's most elite fighting forces, and its destruction at Stalingrad shattered the myth of German invincibility. Up until this point, the German military had swept through Europe with rapid victories, but Stalingrad proved that Hitler's armies were not unstoppable. The defeat sent shockwaves through the German high command and had a profound impact on the morale of both the German army and the civilian population. Stalingrad's fall was the first major, decisive defeat for Nazi Germany on the Eastern Front, and it marked the beginning of a long, slow retreat that would ultimately lead to the collapse of the Third Reich. Following the surrender, the German army never regained the offensive momentum it had once enjoyed. While Hitler continued to insist on holding territory at all costs, the defeat at Stalingrad set in motion a chain of events that would lead to further defeats across the Eastern Front. In the months following the battle, Soviet forces began a series of counteroffensives that would push the Germans further west. The Red Army, emboldened by their victory at Stalingrad, launched what would become a relentless advance, recapturing key cities like Kharkov and Kursk, and gradually driving the Germans out of Soviet territory. By the end of 1943, the Soviets had regained control of much of the territory they had lost during the initial stages of Operation Barbarossa. Stalingrad also had a significant impact on the broader strategic picture of the war. The battle forced the Germans to divert crucial resources and manpower from other fronts to reinforce the Eastern Front, weakening their ability to fight in North Africa, Western Europe, and Italy. The loss of the Sixth Army at Stalingrad, combined with the defeat of Rommel's Afrika Korps at the Second Battle of El Alamein, marked the beginning of a multi-front struggle that would eventually overwhelm Nazi Germany. On the Allied side, the victory at Stalingrad was seen as a turning point in the war. It boosted the morale of the Soviet Union and gave the Allies confidence that Nazi Germany could be defeated. The victory also solidified Joseph Stalin's position as a leader of the Allied powers, and it helped foster a sense of cooperation between the Soviet Union, the United States, and Britain, even though tensions between the three would later resurface after the war. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad was a symbol of resilience and determination. The victory had come at an enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers and civilians had died in the defense of the city. But the triumph was also a testament to the Soviet people's ability to endure incredible hardship and emerge victorious. Stalingrad became a rallying point for Soviet propaganda, and Stalin used the battle as proof that the Soviet Union could stand up to and defeat the fascist invaders. Stalingrad was not just a military victory, it was a moral victory for the Soviet Union, one that would resonate throughout the rest of the war. The battle became a symbol of Soviet strength, and the defense of the city was held up as an example of the sacrifices the Soviet people were willing to make to protect their homeland. In the years following the battle, Stalingrad would be remembered as one of the greatest Soviet triumphs, and it played a significant role in shaping the Soviet narrative of the war. While the Soviet Union celebrated its victory, the city of Stalingrad lay in ruins. The scale of destruction was staggering. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to rubble, and the infrastructure of the city had been almost completely destroyed. For the civilians who had survived the siege, life after the battle was grim. The city had to be rebuilt from scratch, and the human toll of the battle would leave deep scars on the population. Many families had lost loved ones, and the trauma of the siege lingered for years to come. As the war continued, the lessons of Stalingrad were not forgotten. For the Soviets, the battle had demonstrated the importance of defense in depth and the effectiveness of combined arms operations. Soviet generals, particularly Georgy Zhukov and Vasily Chukov, who had played key roles in the victory, would go on to lead Soviet forces in future battles, using the tactics they had honed in Stalingrad to great effect. For the Germans, the defeat at Stalingrad forced a re-evaluation of their strategy on the Eastern Front. The loss of an entire army, combined with the failure to secure the Caucasus oil fields, dealt a crippling blow to Hitler's plans for dominance in the East. The Germans were now on the defensive, and while they would continue to fight fiercely, the initiative had shifted decisively to the Soviets. In the aftermath of Stalingrad, the German people, who had been led to believe in the invincibility of the Wehrmacht, began to lose faith in the Nazi leadership. The scale of the defeat could not be hidden, and the casualties were impossible to ignore. For many Germans, Stalingrad represented the beginning of the end for Nazi Germany, a realization that the war they had once expected to win quickly was now turning into a long and bitter struggle for survival. Stalingrad's impact reached far beyond the borders of the Soviet Union and Germany. The battle's significance was felt around the world. It became a defining moment in World War II, a reminder of the human cost of war, and a turning point that helped shape the outcome of the conflict. The defeat of the Sixth Army marked the beginning of Nazi Germany's decline, and the victory of the Red Army signaled the rise of Soviet military power, which would continue to play a dominant role throughout the remainder of the war and into the post-war world. Stalingrad had become more than just a battle, it had become a legend, a symbol of sacrifice, resilience, and the power of collective determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The psychological impact of Stalingrad, a war of morale. The Battle of Stalingrad didn't just leave physical devastation in its wake, it also profoundly impacted the psychological state of both Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union. Stalingrad became a powerful symbol, shaping morale, political discourse, and military strategy for the remainder of World War II and beyond. For Nazi Germany, the defeat at Stalingrad was a shock to the national psyche. Until then, Hitler's war machine had seemed unstoppable. From the invasion of Poland to the rapid conquest of France, the Wehrmacht had secured victory after victory, and many Germans believed in the invincibility of their military. Stalingrad shattered that illusion. The destruction of the Sixth Army, which had once been considered one of the finest in the German military, was devastating. For the first time, the German people were faced with the harsh reality that the war might not be won, and the consequences of this realization were profound. The propaganda machine, which had been so effective in glorifying Nazi victories, now struggled to explain the enormity of the defeat. In the months leading up to the surrender, German newspapers and radio broadcasts had celebrated the ongoing fight in Stalingrad, portraying the battle as a heroic struggle that would eventually lead to victory. The sudden and complete collapse of the Sixth Army, however, was impossible to hide. For many Germans, Stalingrad marked the beginning of doubt, not just in the war effort but in Hitler's leadership itself. Joseph Goebbels, Hitler's chief propagandist, famously delivered his total war speech in February 1943, just weeks after the defeat. In this speech, Goebbels attempted to rally the German people by calling for total commitment to the war, framing the conflict as a life-or-death struggle for the survival of the nation. But even as Goebbels spoke of renewed determination, the reality was that the loss at Stalingrad had deeply wounded the German war effort. The myth of Nazi invincibility had been broken, and the morale of both the military and the civilian population began to crumble. The psychological impact on the Wehrmacht was equally severe. The defeat not only decimated the Sixth Army but also undermined the confidence of German soldiers across all fronts. The Eastern Front, which had once been seen as a path to victory, now became a place of fear and uncertainty. Soldiers who had believed in the inevitable conquest of the Soviet Union were now faced with the harsh reality of a determined and resilient enemy. The sense of invincibility that had driven German troops forward in the early years of the war was replaced by a growing sense of desperation and defeat. In contrast, the Soviet victory at Stalingrad had a galvanizing effect on the Red Army and the Soviet people. After suffering devastating losses during the first year of Operation Barbarossa, the victory at Stalingrad was seen as a turning point, a symbol that the Soviet Union could not only resist the Nazi invasion but also push back and defeat the enemy. The defense of Stalingrad became a rallying cry for the entire nation, and the battle was immortalized in Soviet propaganda as a testament to the strength, courage, and determination of the Soviet people. For the Red Army, Stalingrad was not just a victory, it was proof that the tide of the war was turning in their favor. The psychological boost that came from defeating the previously unstoppable Wehrmacht gave Soviet soldiers newfound confidence as they launched a series of counteroffensives that would drive the Germans further west. Soviet generals, particularly Georgy Zhukov and Vasily Chukov, who had played key roles in the victory, became national heroes, and their strategies would be studied and applied in future battles. The victory also solidified Joseph Stalin's position as the leader of the Soviet Union. Stalin had been personally involved in the planning and execution of the defense of Stalingrad, and the success of the battle strengthened his grip on power. The Soviet people, who had endured unimaginable hardships during the battle, rallied around their leader, and Stalin's reputation as the great leader was cemented. The victory at Stalingrad became a key part of the Soviet narrative, not just during the war but for decades after. The psychological impact of Stalingrad also extended beyond the two nations directly involved in the battle. For the Allies, the Soviet victory was a significant morale booster. It proved that the German war machine could be defeated and gave hope to those fighting on other fronts that the war could eventually be won. In Britain and the United States, the victory was celebrated, and it strengthened the resolve of both nations to continue supporting the Soviet Union in its fight against the Nazis. Stalingrad also played a role in shaping the post-war world. The battle, and the Soviet victory that followed, demonstrated the military and industrial power of the Soviet Union. It also highlighted the brutal nature of the conflict on the Eastern Front, where millions of soldiers and civilians had already died. As the war continued, the lessons learned at Stalingrad, particularly the importance of resilience and determination in the face of overwhelming odds, would be applied to future battles, both on the Eastern Front and in the broader war effort. For Germany, Stalingrad became a symbol of failure, a reminder of the cost of Hitler's ambitions and the consequences of a war that had spiraled out of control. In the years following the battle, the defeat at Stalingrad was used as a cautionary tale, a stark example of the dangers of hubris and overreach. For the soldiers who survived the battle, the psychological scars of the experience would never fully heal. Many of the German prisoners of war taken at Stalingrad would never return home, and those who did were haunted by the memories of the bitter cold, starvation, and relentless fighting. For the Soviet Union, Stalingrad became a myth, a story of heroic sacrifice that would be told and retold for generations. The battle was enshrined in Soviet history as one of the defining moments of the Great Patriotic War, and it became a central part of the Soviet identity. Monuments were erected, films were made, and the name Stalingrad became synonymous with resistance and victory against seemingly insurmountable odds. In the end, the psychological impact of Stalingrad was as significant as the physical destruction it caused. It changed the way both nations viewed the war and each other, and it shaped the course of the conflict in ways that would reverberate long after the last shots were fired. The battle had been a turning point, not just in terms of military strategy but in the collective psyche of those who had fought it. The legacy of Stalingrad, how it shaped World War II and beyond. The Battle of Stalingrad ended in February 1943, but its legacy would ripple through the remainder of World War II and beyond. This single battle reshaped military strategy, altered the course of the war, and left a profound mark on the political and social landscape of the 20th century. As the first major defeat for Nazi Germany, Stalingrad became a pivotal moment in the war, a turning point that shifted the momentum to the Allied powers, particularly on the Eastern Front. One of the most significant aspects of Stalingrad's legacy was how it shattered the myth of Nazi invincibility. Until the battle, the German military had been on a near unstoppable advance across Europe. The early successes of Blitzkrieg, with its rapid and devastating attacks, had led to the fall of numerous countries and created a sense of inevitable German victory. However, Stalingrad changed everything. The defeat of the Sixth Army, one of the most prestigious forces in the German military, exposed the vulnerabilities of the Nazi war machine and demonstrated that even Hitler's forces could be decisively beaten. For the Soviet Union, the victory at Stalingrad was more than just a military triumph, it was a psychological and political victory. It proved to both the Soviet people and the world that the Red Army could withstand the full force of the German onslaught and fight back effectively. This newfound confidence empowered the Soviet leadership to launch a series of counteroffensives that would eventually lead to the complete liberation of Soviet territory and the push toward Berlin. After Stalingrad, the Soviet military went on the offensive, regaining lost ground and launching the Kursk offensive in July 1943, the largest tank battle in history and another crushing defeat for the Germans. Stalingrad's victory had emboldened the Soviets, and from that point on, the Germans were increasingly forced into a defensive posture on the Eastern Front. The Red Army, now buoyed by its successes, steadily pushed the Germans back, culminating in the eventual fall of Berlin in May 1945. On the global stage, Stalingrad played a critical role in strengthening the Allied coalition. The victory reassured Britain, the United States, and other Allied nations that the Soviet Union was capable of defeating Nazi Germany, encouraging them to continue providing much-needed resources through Lend-Lease programs. This mutual cooperation between the Allies helped to ensure the defeat of Nazi Germany and created the foundation for the post-war balance of power. Stalingrad also had profound implications for Hitler's leadership. Prior to the battle, Hitler had been seen as a military genius, capable of directing his armies with precision and brilliance. But the failure at Stalingrad revealed his flaws. His insistence on holding the city at all costs, even when retreat could have saved his army, showed the dangers of his hubris and overconfidence. It marked the beginning of a decline in Hitler's influence over his generals, many of whom began to question the Führer's decisions more openly as the war continued. Stalingrad was a clear example of how political ideology had begun to override sound military strategy in the German command structure. The human cost of the Battle of Stalingrad also left an indelible mark on the memory of the war. It's estimated that more than 2 million people, soldiers and civilians, lost their lives during the battle. The devastation wrought by months of bombardment, starvation, and hand-to-hand combat left Stalingrad in ruins. For the survivors, both military and civilian, the battle was a traumatic experience that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Stalingrad became a symbol not just of Soviet victory but also of the suffering and destruction that war brings. In the years following the war, the battle became a central element of Soviet identity. The Soviet government immortalized the defense of Stalingrad in its official history, celebrating the battle as one of the greatest victories in the Great Patriotic War. Monuments were erected, such as the massive The Motherland Calls statue on Mami of Kurgan, which commemorated the sacrifice of those who fought and died in the battle. The city itself was later renamed Volgograd, but the name Stalingrad continued to carry immense symbolic weight within the Soviet Union and remains synonymous with resilience and heroism to this day. For the rest of the world, Stalingrad came to symbolize the turning of the tide in World War II. It demonstrated that the Axis powers were not invincible, and it gave hope to occupied nations and resistance movements across Europe. The battle also served as a grim reminder of the brutality of total war, where entire cities and populations were caught in the crossfire of larger geopolitical struggles. In the context of military history, Stalingrad became a case study in both the successes and failures of urban warfare. The battle highlighted the difficulties of fighting in built-up, urban environments where conventional tactics like blitzkrieg were less effective. Both sides had to adapt to the unique challenges of the city, and the Soviet use of hugging the enemy, getting as close to the German forces as possible to neutralize their superior firepower, became a hallmark of effective defensive strategy in future conflicts. The lessons learned from Stalingrad also influenced Cold War military strategy. As the Soviet Union and the United States emerged as superpowers in the post-war era, both nations studied the tactics and outcomes of the battle to prepare for potential urban and total war scenarios. Stalingrad's significance went far beyond World War II, shaping military thought for decades to come. The legacy of Stalingrad was also felt in the Nuremberg trials, where Nazi leaders were held accountable for war crimes and crimes against humanity. The suffering endured by both Soviet soldiers and civilians during the battle was cited as evidence of the horrors inflicted by the Nazi regime. Stalingrad became a symbol of resistance to tyranny, and its place in history as a moment of triumph against seemingly insurmountable odds remains unquestioned. In the decades following World War II, the memory of Stalingrad continued to resonate. For many, it represented the ultimate test of human endurance and the will to survive. It stood as a reminder of the high cost of war, both in terms of human lives and the destruction of cities and cultures. Stalingrad was not just a military battle, it was a battle for the soul of a nation, and it remains one of the most significant and iconic moments in the history of the 20th century. Today, Stalingrad is remembered as a defining moment in World War II, an event that changed the course of the conflict and had far-reaching consequences for the world order that followed. Its legacy endures, reminding us of the horrors of war but also the strength and resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity.